Welcome back to the second episode in building a custom app from scratch with Make. In this episode, we're going to build out our first specific modules. We're not counting the Make an API call. First specific module for listing the workflow names. We'll then also build a second module for getting the workflow information. We'll be covering 2 endpoints. And we'll be configuring our first RPC or remote procedure call, which will actually enable us to dynamically load in the options, the mappable parameters for our second module over here, get workflow information. Let's get started. And before we move on to building our next module, just one quick tweak to the stuff that we built in the previous episode is in the connections tab in the API key. I actually want to change the parameters so that the API key is not of type text, but instead type password. This will hide it when sending it up. So for example, if it's pasted during a screen recording session, it won't be visible. And additionally, it will also not save that field into the autofill settings in the browser, which again makes sure that the API key is not exposed. So now if we go to our scenario, refresh, and try to set up a new connection. Over here, add. As you can see, the API key will now be hidden, which is what we want. And again, once it's filled out, it won't be set to autofill. Let's now go ahead and start building our next module. We'll be replicating this list workflow names endpoint over here, which will just simply return an array of all the workflow names. This will be useful just as of itself to understand what workflow names are available on the account, but also then to be used in conjunction with the other endpoints. Essentially, we'll be replicating what we built in the last episode using this custom make an API call over here. Let's head over to the modules tab inside of our custom app configuration. Click create a new module, and in the type there would be really 2 types that would be applicable to the scenario, either action or search. Now the biggest difference in between action and search is that action is supposed to return one single result and will return it as a single bundle inside of make. Meanwhile, search is intended for returning multiple items and will actually return a separate bundle for each one of the results, like items in the results that it gets from the API. The idea here is that, for example, if you're returning multiple records from your database, let's say, that you use the search module so that the user can easily iterate and perform an action for each one of those items returned from the module without, for example, having to use an array iterator inside of make. In our case, search does seem like the best fit here, again considering they'll be returning an array with multiple items. So let's click search. In the connection, we'll choose API key. For the name, we'll stick with the naming of the endpoint over here and the naming as well in the dashboard, which is workflows. So it's list workflow names. The name is the internal name, so list workflow names. That's why I'm also not using any spaces. And then for the label, it will be list workflow names. That's the one shown to the user. And the description will be returns the list of all workflow names available like under your account. Click save. All right, let's start setting up. So first of all, the URL. Again, this will be relative to our base URL, so .gavel.io. That means that this part is the one that we need to copy into here. The method will be get as well, as we can see, get. We don't need any headers, we don't need any query parameters either. And the search module then has this iterate response.iterate key, which gives understanding to the system of what items should it return and split into those bundles that as I explained before. So in this case, considering that the API doesn't even return an object, it just returns a simple array, what we'll be doing is we'll be iterating upon the whole of the body. Okay, so the full output object. The output, if we leave it as an item, it will just be simply a text value, which honestly, I'm not sure if it will work. So let's test it out and see if it actually works. And then the limit would be for limiting the output, the number of output bundles returned by the module. This obviously is useful if you have lots of data coming through. In this case, again, considering it's just all of the workflows defined in the account, probably it will not be that many. And we also don't have any indication of that there's some kind of pagination enabled here. So we'll just leave it as is and not actually implement any limits on the response. All right, let's click Save Changes, and let's actually go to our scenario and test it out. Gavel, list workflow names. Okay, so the search and the limit, this actually parameters defined over here. So again, we don't really need them, considering we don't have any filtering capabilities in the module. So let's just remove them, reload. List workflow names, connection, Gavel API key. Let's run this. All right, so it says invalid item in module output, expected object, but found string. So the idea is that each one of those bundles actually represents an object with multiple keys inside. It could be single key, it could be multiple keys, but not just simply a text field. So it didn't work. How do we fix it? Not an issue. In this output, you can either define, again, the full thing, or you can actually define a custom object. So the way that we're gonna do it is I'm just gonna cut this out. I'm gonna define an object, and within it, I will say name, and will be the full item. So the name will be the key, and the value will be the actual name of the module. Again, you can do it with as many different, essentially, keys that you want. You can also do things such as, for example, if the API returns an object and you want to include all of its parameters over here in this manner and then add some extra, what you simply do is you place 3 dots over here and then you leave this item as is over here. What this will do is we'll kind of like break it down, split them into the key value pairs as required, and then you'll be able to add extra keys on top of that. But again, considering that in our case the item is not an actual object, it's just a string, we're just something like this. So name, and then the name of the workflow as a string. Let's go back, let's reload, see if this works this time. Okay, perfect, that's worked. As you can see, we now have the name, sample intake form, and we have the 2 bundles. As I explained previously, it returns multiple bundles, meaning that any modules added after it will actually be repeated multiple times. So for demonstration, I'll just remove this module, like this, and then I'll just use a set variable over here, just for the purpose of demonstration. Click run once. As you can see, considering we had 2 bundles over here, this module ran twice, right? So we have 2 operations. Now, if the user would want to simply use it as like a simple array, the only thing they need to do is add a module over here, array aggregator, aggregate on this list workflow names, and then for aggregated fields, they can just select everything. And so what this will do is we'll combine all the bundles over here into a simple array, as you can see, and then any modules after that will just run once. So the user also has that flexibility. The only question is really what is the use case that you see most applicable in this case. And again, considering we're just listing all the workflows, it's returning an array. Search module does make more sense that it actually separate into multiple bundles so that any further actions can be performed on each workflow individually. All right, So this is working out. The only other thing that we need to finish off is this interface. Essentially, what it defines is how will these values be displayed here. So instead of just having, for example, lowercase name, it capitalizes it, makes it a bit more intuitive, and also defines the data type of the information we're getting from the server. So in this case, for example, would be text. The reason that it already was capitalized there is because there actually was already a parameter called name here in the interface. So we'll just leave this one over here, type text. That's perfect. Click Save Changes. And now again, let's reload, make sure everything works fine. Perfect. So we have our two bundles with the two names. Module setup. That was very quick. Let's move on to the second module, list workflow variables. What this will do, it will return all the variables defined under a specific workflow. For that, we'll need to provide the workflow name, which could be used in conjunction with the list workflow names, which we'll be doing in just a moment. And it will return an object like this with the names and the data types and, for example, all the different options available for each one of the variables defined under the workflow. Let's head over to make and create a new module. In this case, I'll be leaving type as action because I believe that it wouldn't be the best user experience if we just return each variable over here as a separate bundle. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. I think the user would expect it as just one single array. And additionally, we also have it like this as attachments and success. So we'll be leaving it as action instead of a search to just return one bundle. The connection will be the API key. The module action will be read, and then the name will be list workflow variables as we have defined in the documentation. Let me just format it properly. And for the description, we'll say returns the list of all variables defined under a specific, or like in a specific workflow. Returns the list of all variables defined in a specific workflow. Click Save. As for the URL, it will be the following. Now, as you can see, this page types is actually a query parameter. So instead of defining it in this URL section, we have a separate key for this here, query string, where we can define any query parameters that we want. So the name in this case would be PG types, and the value of it will be dynamic, which means that it will be defined in the parameters section. So it will be parameters dot, and let's call it workflow name. Let's also remove this from here. I think considering that the list workflow names actually returns the, well, if a user defines it manually, then it wouldn't make sense for this YAML portion to stay here. So they can just say, for example, like divorce workflow, right? Or evictions. Now, considering that as the options will probably be already automatically fetching all the workflow names using this endpoint, and they already contain the .yaml extension, I'm inclined to just leave this parameter as it is here and not add .yaml here at the end, right? So we'll just, in case the user supplies it manually, they will also need to include the .yaml at the end. So let's leave it like this. The headers we'll remove, and in the response, for now, we'll just be return all the body. We'll handle with it later once we test it out. In the mappable parameters, we'll have the workflow name, the type. For now, let's leave it as text while we are testing it out. After that, we'll implement a functionality using an RPC, remote procedure call, to actually load all the workflow names into here so the user can simply select it in a set of options instead of having to type it manually. But for now, let's leave it to test as text just for the purposes of testing. The label will be workflow name, and the required will be true because it is mandatory. In the interface, for now, let's just remove this. Click Save Changes. All right. And let's head over here and test it out. Okay, so Gavel, list workflow variables, and the workflow name, let's use one of our, say for example, the simple form. Actually, to get one of them, we can just do this. So simple form.yaml, and run this module. Okay, fantastic. So we get the attachments. We actually also get this DocuSign config, which wasn't really defined in the documentation. And we have the types list with all of the different variables that we have here. Now, considering that API actually returns a few more things apart from listing the workflow variables, I mean, obviously they're here, but it's also returning configuration, for example, for DocuSign, and also for any attachments available under the workflow. I'm actually inclined to rename the module, and instead of calling list workflow variables, call it something like get workflow info, which will include then all the attachments, any other configuration such as DocuSign, and then obviously the list of all the variables. So I think let's do that. Considering that we cannot change the name, the internal name once defined here, we'll just have to create a new module again, but that's all fine. Create a new module, call it action. Module action will be read, and for the name, I will actually name it get workflow. And the label will be get workflow information. And as the description will be returns information about specific workflow, including any attachments, including the list of attachments, list of variables, and DocuSign configuration. Workflow configuration, click save, and we'll just be replicating as well what we had over here in terms of mappable parameters as well. And then this action we can remove. Now, is this, no, that's not, sorry, no, this one, so it's list workflow variables. This one is the one that we need to remove. Now, is this, sticking to the book of the API? No, but this is providing a better user experience, I feel like, for the user of the Make app. So I think that's a good choice over here. Obviously, some design choices that you need to make, obviously, as you go along, but let's now define the interface. And again, the interface is essentially, once we get information from the API, how should it be formatted, and how should each one of those fields be called instead of, for example, like types_JSON. Now, instead of having to type it out all manually and define it all manually, Make actually has this nice feature over here called the generator, where you can just paste an object and it will generate its configuration for you. So let's put this whole thing into there. Options, generator, content type is JSON, and the sample data, we just paste the whole thing over here. Click generate, and as you can see over here, it has generated the full spec. So let's just copy it and paste it over here. Let's make sure like all the naming is correct. So first of all, attachments, it's an array. Inside of it, the specification of each object inside of the array is the following. So it's type collection, so an object. The specification then of the object is the file name. Then let's check how it looks like. So the file name, which is text string. Let's call it. Let's add a label to it, which is a bit more user-friendly file name. Then the formats is, well, the list of formats. Again, let's add a label to it of formats. The only issue with this automatic generation is that any objects that are like on second level or lower in terms of depth, the labels are not automatically created. So, and finally the name is just, well, just the name without the extension. So label name. All right, we are labeling this whole thing as attachments. That's cool. DocuSign config, DocuSign config as well. Type is collection, because it's an object. Then we have this documents, which is an array. Let's again add a label to it, which is a bit more user-friendly. Documents. I'm actually not sure how this array is structured itself. Probably it's a few objects as well. The one way to find out is if I actually enable that integration and add a few documents there, we'll get an idea of how that information is structured. But for now, let's just leave it as is. Enabled will be Boolean. Again, let's add a label. Enabled. Recipients also an array. Again, to understand the structure of the array, we will need to actually set something up with that integration on the workflow and test it out. Recipients. And then settings as well. Let's label here for settings. And the only setting that we see over here for now is just include uploads, which is a Boolean. Include uploads. All right. And then finally we have the success, which is again just a Boolean. Which I'm actually not particularly sure is needed for to be returned, considering that it's just like an internal thing. So if we want actually to include a key from an object that is returned from the server, we can do that. So first of all, let's remove it from the interface, just so that again it doesn't occupy space here. And then in the actual communication, if we remove it from the interface, it won't actually remove it from the object that's being returned by our make module. So if you want to do that, we'll need to modify it here in the response.output. So how can we return the full body but omit a specific key? Well, there's an omit function for that. So omits the given keys of the object and returns the rest. And the key that we want to omit in this case is success. Let's click Save Changes. And if we now go back and test it out, that was the old version, so we don't actually have it anymore. Create a new module, get workflow information, workflow name, again we need it. So let's run this one, simpleform.yaml, simpleform.yaml. Let's run this. And as you can see, that success key is now omitted. It's no longer there. That's perfect. And as you can see as well, the attachments, all the keys inside and DocuSign config are properly formatted as we have defined inside of the interface. Now the last thing is just defining this types JSON. So let's go to the interface, types JSON. I'm not sure types JSON is the best label. So I'm inclined, and considering that it's just returning a collection with the list of all the variables, it's again not the best user experience. So instead of doing this, let's actually modify it so that this module returns the attachments, returns the DocuSign config, and then immediately returns the variables list. So moves this types list up above, and obviously renames it using the interface. How do we do that? In a similar way as we did now previously with the meetings of success, we can also emit, in this case, this types underscore JSON. Obviously, if you just leave it like this, then we'll just simply not return it. But we actually want to modify how it's returned, like at what level it is returned, right? So instead of now selecting the full output over here, we'll create a new custom object. As explained previously, we can unpack essentially all the keys and values, all the key value pairs using this 3 dots. Place our output object, which emits success and emits types JSON over here, and then we'll simply add a new variable, also a new key to it, which will be called variables list, and the value will be body dot types JSON dot types list. So it will be this. So now instead of having this types JSON with an object inside with types list and then the array, we'll just have variables list and immediately have all the information over here available. So variables list, click save changes, and then again in the interface, we'll now switch it up a bit. This name will be variables list as defined in the output object manually. Its label will be variables list, and all this part with the types JSON we can actually remove. And so we'll immediately have this variables list over here. Let's just format it properly, which will be an array, and inside of it will be a collection. Cool. Let's click save changes, see if this works. Run this module only. Okay, so something is not working out. Let's see what's up. Actually, I think this should be like this. Let's test it. All right, perfect. Sorry. So yeah, instead of 3 dots, we also need to add the curly brackets. And if we do that, we get our attachments, we get our DocuSign config, and we get the variables list with then all of our variables inside of here. No more confusing variable names or objects. The only one last thing left now is in this interface, just to define the labels as well here. Label data type, label required, and then variable, I'm not sure exactly what this is. So data type object required variable, okay, so it's name. I guess it's name. So let's call this name, so the variable name. And as you can also see, we also have sometimes this label added to a few of them. So let's add another object over here. The name will be label, and the label will be label. And I also see that sometimes we have this parent. So that's another object that's required over here. Name will be parent, type text, and then label parent as well. Click Save Changes. Let's reload. Let's run this. Variables list, data type required name, data type label name. Then we have the parent somewhere as well. I'm not sure where there it is. Okay, so the parent is also formatted properly. The only thing left and then is this selections, which just displays all the different options for drop-down fields. So let's add it here as well. Name selections, and it will be an array. Label is selections, and the specification of the array. Well, considering it's just a simple array, I don't think. Oh no, yeah. So we just say type and then text. So it will be an array of simply text or strings. Click Save Changes. Again, reload. And run this module. Perfect. And then the selections, we have this now as well formatted properly as an array with the correct name. Cool. So like everything is ready here. Yeah, I don't see any other issues. The only thing left now really is defining this workflow name selection, right? Because again, we don't want the user to manually have to type this in. We want to just give the user the ability to select one of the options. How do we do this? There's a tool for that called Remote Procedure Calls, RPCs. Essentially, what they do is when you open up a new module, it will load some information for the user to select, and the user will be able to work with it. All right, how do we do it? Let's open up a new tab. We'll head over to this Remote Procedures over here. The name of it, internal name, I always like to store them as well with RPC. So RPC list workflow names. And essentially this request will replicate what we have already defined in this list workflow names module. All right, essentially it will be something very, very similar. So list workflow names, RPC list workflow names. The connection will be the API key. And for the configuration, we can actually just almost copy all of this. The only difference is that in the response, we need to define, again, similar to a search module, the iterate. And then the output needs to have two things. One, the label, which will be visible to the user. And second, the actual value, which will be passed on the backend, right? So let's change up the URL. Method will be get. No query parameters. Nothing in the body, nothing in the headers. Iterating will be just iterating upon the body, considering it's a simple array. And the output won't be a specific key inside of each item inside of the body. The value will be actually the full thing, i.e. the name of the workflow, including .yaml extension, which again we need in here. While the label, for better user experience, I would actually remove the .yaml extension from it. So we'll use the replace IML function, which is available inside of make as well. So any functions actually that are available inside of make. So for example, if we go over here and we search for replace, any functions available in here will also be available inside of the editor in the make custom apps editor. All right. So let's have a look at how we need to define it. So first of all, we define the actual string where we want to replace certain occurrences, then the search string, and then the replacement string. Sounds good. So within the item, we'll be replacing .yml and we'll be replacing it with simply an empty string. The only difference in between the editor and this is that here you use commas, while in make scenarios you use the semicolons to separate the different parameters. Obviously as well in this we could instead of using replace, we could just cut down the last 4 characters of the string, but again, preferences. So we have the label defined, we have the value defined. Let's click save changes, and in terms of parameters, we don't really need anything. All right, so let's test it out. Test RPC. Choose the connection, so Gavel API key. Click. And as you can see, we have an array of objects with labels and values. The label has the name without the YAML, and then the value actually has the full name as needs to be used within the API. Fantastic. So we have the RPC defined. The question now is, how do we integrate it into our previous module? Let's go back to get workflow information module in the mappable parameters. Again, we had this as type text. Now we can actually replace it with type select, and select requires a separate key which is called options. And inside of those options, we can either define an array directly with all the different options that it's going to have, or we can use an RPC. And the way we use an RPC is simply type in RPC, and it will pop up with all the names of the RPC that you have under your account. The only thing that needs to be added now is this. So RPC list workflow names, click save changes. And if we now go back, refresh, let's remove this. Gavel, get workflow information. And as you can see, it's loading it in the backend and presenting us with a select. Perfect sample intake form or simple form. Simple form. Let's say if we then change it to the map type, you'll be able to see, okay, what actual value is in the backend, including the .yml extension. Click OK. Let's run this module. Fantastic. So everything is returned correctly. And now let's try the other one. So sample intake form. It's a bit more information in there. And as you can see, it does return as well all of the fields for that sample intake form and all the attachments as well correctly. Fantastic. All right. So we have the get workflow information defined. It has friendly user interface, which actually allows the user just to select from the workflows they already have under their account. And we have also defined a separate module for that, for the list and the workflow names. So both of these modules are fully implemented. Additionally, in this episode, we have learned how we can use an RPC to dynamically load information in the mappable parameters of one of the modules. In the next episode, we'll start work on this create workflow session with data, actually filling out one of these workflows with actual data. For that, again, we'll be using this list workflow variables as an RPC to actually dynamically define what values should the user be filling out for each one of the workflows, because obviously for each one it will be different. Stay tuned, and thank you for watching. I hope you got some value out of this.